Hello everybody, and welcome to AI Images. In our previous classes, we've discussed the technologies that drive today's image generation tools, up to generative adversarial networks and diffusion models. You've seen how GANs compare images from training data to generated images and learn from the process until they create photorealistic representations. You've also seen how diffusion models walk backward through an image's deterioration, denoising an image until the model arrives at something new. And we talked about clip and lay-on, tools for pairing images and text together in ways that help you steer a diffusion model with your own text or prompts. Today, we're going to dig deeper into these datasets and look at what's inside of them. One of the main reasons we're doing this is because we often mistake our prompts for the input into something like Stable Diffusion or Midjourney. We assume that we are the ones making the image because we are the ones who put the prompt into the system. But the prompt is not the input. The input is the massive data set of images, and the prompt is simply navigating what's inside that data set and the aggregation of all of this data. Remember how diffusion works. As you step backward from noise into an image, you're moving the model across all of these directions set by your prompt. But that's leading back to something that the model has already learned. To think better about diffusion models in AI image generation as of right now is to think about the data set as the inputs and our prompt as our way of steering through those inputs, steering through that information with the prompt, giving instructions for how the system can navigate that data set, and then interpolate an image from all of that data. We will talk about what's in the data set. It's a crucial part of understanding these systems. Another thing that's valuable about this is if you think about the image set as your input, then you know what to look for. You know what to ask for in order to get certain results. You'll be better at understanding how to ask for things, how to trigger certain combinations, how to steer your way through. Now, it's still going to take some practice. This is really just the fundamentals of understanding how to even think about what's in there. But eventually, I think one of our goals is to be able to look at an image that we've generated and say, okay, what's going on here? Maybe there's something you want to change in it. Maybe there's something you want to understand about why you're getting a certain result. And being educated and knowledgeable about these systems means that you'll have some idea as to why this output is the way it is. Finally, and inevitably, we're going to confront some challenging realities around race, gender, and power within these datasets. It's important for understanding when these images are biased, so we can put in the work of mitigating that bias. This ranges all the way from social harms of things like representation, who's included in the dataset and who isn't included, and how people are presented, to things like how are people being labeled and categorized. That's an inherent part of the system. So how are stereotypes rendered in these systems, and is it possible to do it in a way that doesn't dehumanize us? We've already seen that the histories of these technologies often go further back than we ever might have imagined, and this story is no different. This one starts in 1877. At that time, there was a growing social belief in what we call scientific positivism, which J.H. Turner defines as a way of thinking, quote, that proposed the only authentic knowledge is scientific knowledge, and that all things are ultimately measurable. This idea of measurement was at the heart of a photographic project by a British sociologist, Francis Galton, who invented the practice of composite portraits. Composite portraits were a single image made from a number of other photographs, all of which were assigned to a category. Galton's categories included race, class, professions, and other descriptors. And then he would create a kind of statistically average face from all of the faces in that category. So this should sound familiar. This is exactly what AI is doing in our image generators, drawing categorical information from descriptions of images found online. And this practice goes back to Francis Galton. Galton believed that personality was written into the shape of our faces. This included our potential for success and our likelihood of criminality. To show this, he exposed multiple photographs of mugshots from known criminals to a single photographic plate, centered on the eyes, essentially drawing one face over the other until there was not one face on the plate, but a blurry composite of many faces. Through this practice, a single common face for that category would take shape. This composite image, he suggested, should be used to identify people as criminal types. He was clear that if someone looked like the average face of a criminal, they must be a criminal themselves. Galton came to believe that these images were statistical averages to a particular mean. In fact, Galton invented the idea of correlation in statistics, a tool for finding patterns still used by machine learning today. The idea that data has correlations or statistical relationships is what makes these systems work. Galton was also, as you may have guessed, an avowed eugenicist. Eugenics is the disproven belief that some classes and races of people are genetically inferior to others, and that ultimately eliminating those inferior races could create a superior race. Galton was not only a believer in this theory, he personally named it and published books advocating for it. And so these two principles, composite photography and statistical correlation, are literally derived from the same man who advocated for the elimination of certain people based on their physical appearances. And composite photography and statistical correlation were both used to justify that claim. Galton used these composites to make his case that certain human facial features were predestined to create criminality, while other facial features would breed, literally, superiority. Of course, there were no surprises in these findings. Ultimately, he was only suggesting that the poor and oppressed minorities of British rule, including its colonies, deserved to be oppressed, and that the aristocracy deserved to be in power. These tools of statistics, composites, and photographs were part of a mechanism to assert white supremacy over others in the British Empire. Now, Galton made all kinds of composite images intended to categorize and label a variety of types of people. One series shows us the stereotypical Jewish schoolboy, another the stereotypical aristocrat. He made composite images of successful families and suggested it was their biology and genes that made them successful, rather than their unique access to wealth and power. And families of criminals were born this way, he said, evidenced by the shape of their faces. Galton's belief came down to the idea that if people looked alike, they were alike. At the heart of what Galton was saying were a number of myths that are increasingly prevalent today. The first is that the camera was objective and neutral in its facts. The camera was the hot new medium of the day, much as AI is in our current moment, and many still mistake AI for being objective and neutral. Second was his practice of creating composite images of people and sorting them into categories. Likewise, this continues today. When you create a prompt and stable diffusion for a criminal or professor, for example, you are likely drawing on similar reference points. Compare these two images and ask yourself, why are these the criminals? And why are these the professors? How does Midjourney form an idea of what a criminal or a professor looks like? Well, the answer, as you may already know from our past talks, is that the categories of image datasets come through as stereotypes in the outputs. Presenting these images as they are runs the risk of reinforcing stereotypes already embedded into these image captions. But let's get back to Galton and his idea that correlation means causation. Galton, who pioneered this idea of correlation, was convinced that it could explain all kinds of phenomena. Today, a lot of AI is dedicated to automating the discovery of statistical correlations in large data sets. We have all this data and we need some way to understand it, so we let the machine look for correlations. And today we risk the same fallacy that Galton did. We imagine that what the machine says is true, but we don't ask why it's true. AI can also be used to reinforce power structures in the same way that Galton's technologies did. By controlling the images in their categories, Galton was able to say anything he wanted about the people he put onto film. He was able to carve out a dataset from the world at large and then point at that dataset and call it evidence. Leila Lee Morrison wrote about Francis Galton and his connection to today's algorithms back in 2019. The advantage of the camera for Galton lay in its ability to visually represent the abstracting process of statistics in the form of facial images. With the practice of repetitive exposure, that is, in multiplying the reproduction process by photographing the photograph, Galton's composites transformed the use of the imaging apparatus into a form of statistical measurement. Galton's use of the camera to apply the abstractive process of statistics resulted in a depiction that, as Daston and Gallison put it, passed from individual to group. I raise this because of how important it is to acknowledge, and how little we do acknowledge, that AI images are tied directly to three strands of thought that came from a man who used these tools to advocate for eugenics and ultimately paved the path to a specific logic of genocide that decimated human lives across the 20th century. This is not to say we can't use these tools. It's a reminder to be vigilant that they contain traces of these ideas, and that uncritically embracing the logic of these systems might steer us into a position where we find ourselves aligned with these logics. What I want to encourage about these tools is that we use them in ways that challenge those logics and those ideas. On that note, you may be saying, that was all over 100 years ago, and surely these things can't be relevant today. Well, let's find out. I want to start with an easy one. Let's use the prompt typical American using stable diffusion. Let's take a minute to remember what diffusion does with this prompt. We'll walk through it. It starts with a frame of noise, and it's going to try to remove that noise. And it's going to remove that noise based on patterns that it has learned from removing noise from a whole bunch of images that are associated with the prompt, typical American. It'll remove that noise, assuming that my prompt is the caption of the image that it's trying to repair. And it starts by singing out clusters of pixel information that match some of what it learned about how those images of typical Americans was breaking down, and what patterns and things were represented in those images. These images are taken from the internet and put into the training data, and the noise that the model starts with keeps being removed until it matches something that is abstracted, a composite that is created from that vast data set. So here we go. Now we have a picture. And yes, this is one of the first 4 images I got by asking for the image typical American from Stable Diffusion. This is a composite of all images associated with this phrase typical American. It's drawing from a data set that contains many of these pictures, and it's finding points sort of in between all of those pictures. So what do we see? Well, I notice, literally, just looking at what we see, there's face paint with this American flag, which makes some sense, right? The category for American probably is going to trigger the flag, so we'll have the American flag in there. Something that is going to symbolize America, right, is going to make it into the image. If you think about what it learned about images associated with this label American, the flag is certainly present, you have to imagine. It also automatically knows that we're looking for a person, which is interesting, right? Why not an American car? Why does the phrase typical American paired together create the image of a person, as opposed to typical American food or typical American car, like I said? So we can assume that the phrase typical American is probably very often associated with images of people, right? So let's pause here and think about what that means. How do you read this phrase typical American? Is it complimentary? if it isn't complimentary, what is it about typical American that makes it sort of unflattering? When people say typical American, to me, it's not usually meant as a compliment. This is a series of words that is sometimes used as an insult against people. Typical American, as a phrase, is being lumped and associated with all of these images. So let's start thinking about how that comes across. We see that the man is in a cowboy hat. Maybe that is yet another stereotype. He's wearing a leather jacket. He's holding what looks to be some kind of cup, like a giant coffee cup or a Slurpee or something. And so this is what we might call a composite image of an American, taken from a wide range of pictures that were labeled typical American. And so we might ask, what was in the training data for this prompt? Well, we can find out. Leon 5B is open source, and we can go in and we can look at images in the dataset. And Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst have created an interesting tool called Have I Been Trained, which is designed to let artists look up their names and see if they're in the dataset. It's also an interesting way to scan through images that might be used in prompts and see what kind of images are clustered together around that prompt. Now, we'll see in a minute, it's not exactly a one-to-one relationship, but we'll see. We're going to go in and we're going to look and see what images circulate around this prompt. But I need to warn you, if you go and use that site, it is mildly censored, but significant amounts of uncensored stuff is in there. But that's why I'm not going to ask you to use that tool for any assignments. But if you decide to use it for individual research or curiosity, I can't stop you. But be warned, it contains hateful, violent, and pornographic content, even when you put on the not safe for work filter. If you don't want to see that stuff, you've been warned. If you want to learn more about all this without going and looking at the actual data set, some great work has been written about the content by Dr. Abiba Berhani in a 2021 paper on racism and pornography in this particular multimodal data set. And that is linked in the course page. So that said, here we go. This is what we get if we go and look at the data in Leon for American. So what do we notice here? Well, we see the same image repeated 4 times in a meme, and it's this man holding a big gulp from 7-Eleven. So let's think about that one. This means Leon is taking in memes, right? There's memes in the data set, and we have to ask, how many times do you think it saw this meme? Was every version of that meme treated as a new piece of data? Was it lumped together and recognized and ignored, and it only appeared the once? Well, the fact that it's showing up here 4 times suggests that this image, is every time that it occurred on the internet, was incorporated into the label for American. If so, that means that the image is weighted more than other images and has an outsized role in shaping the images associated with this prompt. And I'll get to that in a second. But for now, let's see what else we have in there. There's some face paint, which we also saw in the generated image. There's lots of flags, also in the generated image. There's cowboy hats, also in the generated image. Interestingly, there's some Confederate flags, lots of guns. To the left, there's a man tackling a deer in a Walmart. So there you go. That's what's Leon, and to that extent, many diffusion models are looking at when you type in the prompt typical American. Now, I'm using this example because I am an American and I feel okay talking about the stereotypes that are on display here, but we can see how the system has found this word American connected to images across the web, broken those images down into key aspects of the image, and then reassembled them into the image we saw in the last slide. This image. So when we talk about the data in the data set coming through in the images that are generated by the system, it's not some abstract philosophical idea, right? This is pretty direct. The images in the data set are written into the image that was generated. Now, a caveat here, we're looking at 2 pages of results for training data associated with this word. There are hundreds of pages, right? Remember, Leon 5b, the 5b stands for 5 billion. There are many, many, many more images that are going into this vision of the typical American. And yet, from the first page, we see what is sort of higher priority, and we see what's coming through in our image. So these are not the only images that are contributing to this composite. And if you go down to page 9 or 10 or 300, you might see a variety of other images that show up less frequently when you ask for this prompt. But note that there is a connection between the data set and the image that was generated. There has to be, right? The model doesn't make stuff up. The model learns and reproduces what it learns. Now, how does it learn? Well, I want to stop for a moment and talk about weights. If you're familiar with machine learning, this may not be a new subject, but as promised, this is designed as a class for people who have not even sort of coded before. And so I want to take a minute to talk about machine learning and what it means when we say weights. Broadly speaking, weights are the way computer systems are incentivized towards certain behaviors. Here's an example. Let's say you are building a robot and it's supposed to go get some Halloween candy. Now, your first priority, first thing you'd incentivize in this robot would be safety, right? Because we're all very responsible programmers. So your first goal is to go out and get Halloween candy without hurting anybody. So you would say -5 is the weight associated with hurting someone. So you tell the system, you tell the robot, if you hurt someone, you're losing 5 points almost, right? You can think of it as this sort of game. -5 is the weight of hurting someone. So collisions are the last thing you want this robot to do. So let's say -5 is going to be the last, right? This is not a real algorithm. This is not a real program. Don't do this. But maybe next is we don't want the robot stealing candy from other kids. So we're going to put that at -4. And that means that given a choice between stealing candy from a kid or hurting somebody, it's going to steal the candy, but it's not going to go out and deliberately steal candy. It's unlikely that it's going to come to this choice between hurting a person and stealing candy, but you need to make the priorities clear. So let's think about what happens when we want this. What do we want this robot to do in ways that the robot's going to understand, right? You can't just tell it, go trick-or-treating. But maybe one of the things you could do is you could tell it what candy is. Say you want some Hershey's Kisses, and you want it to put Hershey's Kisses into the bag. So we'll say put candy into bag is number 3, +3. So this is a incentive. This is a positive weight, +3. The most important thing, but let's make sure it's not as important as avoiding collisions or stealing candy, right? So those things are actually prioritized as negative weights to a higher degree. So it's not like, go get 2 pieces of candy, now you can crash into somebody. So now we have a pretty solid set of priorities, and to get it to work, we would put it into steps, like go to the next door, but you don't want that to keep going to the next door. So you're going to penalize going to the same door twice, or more than once even. So again, don't use this as a recipe for your Halloween robot. This is literally me making up an example as I sit here with my slide deck for 5 minutes. This is a quick overview of how weights work. The numbers you have here are weights. They are incentivizing or disincentivizing certain actions for the system. You put these weights in, and then you tell the system to go figure out what to do in an efficient way, given these rules. And it would follow these rules in a way that it would eventually create a pretty efficient system for trick-or-treating. It's prioritizing putting pieces of candy into a bag, and so it's going to think about the best strategy for how to do that. It'll try lots of stuff at first, maybe, but eventually it would learn the most efficient strategy for putting candy into the bag. Maybe it would calculate the shortest distance between doors in the neighborhood, for example. And it would go out and very quickly find its way to those doors and put the candy into the bag. This is the basis of a lot of machine learning in robots, computers, and the AI that we see playing video games. Many of you in this class may be coding, and so you know that a lot of what you're doing in video games is giving it sort of if-thens and priorities, right? So just for fun, there's a problem with this robot. I know I told you I just made it up off the top of my head, and I did, but I based it on a particularly famous mistake. I wonder if you can tell what it is. Think like a computer program. What conclusion or action or behavior do you think it might arrive at by trying to be the most efficient way to put candy into the bag? All right. You can pause it if you want to keep thinking. But basically what we've just created is a classic example of a system that would exhibit a kind of strange emergent behavior. In particular, we've built a system that would put candy into a bag and then dump the bag out, and then put the candy back in the bag and then dump out the bag, and then put candy back in the bag and then dump out the bag, right? That would be the most efficient way of following the instructions we just gave it, which is the top priority is put candy into a bag. So this is one of the elements that comes when you're coding in a way that you can see. You still don't necessarily know how the robot is going to interpret this stuff. There's this range of priorities. What strategies are going to emerge from following these rules and following these weights? Depending on how fast the robot can do it, it might figure out that it should collect a full bag of candy and then dump it out, and then refill the bag and then dump it out. Or it might just stop in front of the first door it gets to, take the first piece of candy, and then just put it in the bag, empty it out, put it in the bag, empty it out. Forever. Not great robots. Either one of those is not a robot that we had in mind, right? Now, with traditional programming and robots, we can see what we did. We could see what we incentivized. And we could go in there and we can get it moving. It's going to be tedious and annoying to test these things, but we can do it. And as we saw, Leon doesn't need anyone to tell it what's in the data set. It is designed to go out and figure this out on its own, because it is a multimodal data set. It means it looks at two pieces of information and correlates them. It looks at text and it looks at images. And it looks at how those images and the text are connected, and it infers a relationship, a correlation, and it uses this to start to generalize across all of the images that it encounters and all of the labels that it encounters. So the weights aren't being decided by people. They're being assigned by what's inside the data set. These data sets are obviously very big, but let's think about a small data set to make this reasonable. Here we have 8 images in our data set, and all 8 are blonde women. So what is this model going to do? It's pretty obvious that the data set's going to give you images of blonde women. Assuming that this is a working model, right? This is a example model. We've scaled it down, but let's say this is a representative of a much larger sample, because you can't just use 8 images to train a GAN or a diffusion model. But let's say, hypothetically, this is representative of what's in the data set. So essentially, blonde women are weighted more heavily in this data set by the simple fact that there are more blonde women in the data set. If we flip one of these women out and add a black man, we will probably most likely get images of white women from the model. White blonde women from the model, because statistically that is what is present. The model will not predict his appearance. We might also have 2 of the same exact women in the data set, and in this case the output is going to look more like her, because she is duplicated in this data set. Now, this is bias, and we mean this in 2 ways. One, it is a biased example. It is a data set full of white blonde women, which might reflect a cultural or social bias. There is also a technical mathematical bias, the presence of some specific features in a dataset more often than others. This bias could be the result of social and cultural bias, right? These things are not necessarily the same, but they aren't necessarily distinct. It could be that nobody has pictures of something. For example, if you try to generate images of an animal that went extinct in the 1700s, you will not have pictures of it. So that is also a form of bias. And sometimes these biases are the result of negligence or intentional exclusion or the availability of data sets. But it's all bias. All of this is particularly useful to know when we are thinking about GANs, by the way, because when we start to collect images for our GANs, we will want to use images that fit a kind of common alignment, but we also want to push it into variety. A lot of the way that we steer a GAN is by thinking about how many versions of a thing there are in our data set. But put that aside for now. I'm flagging this for now. Put this in the back of your head because we will be training again, and this is relevant. For diffusion models, though, it's important to note that bias is also introduced through the text and image pairs. So, for example, if you ask for images of humans kissing, as we talked about in the first class, who is the system defining as human? This is an important question, because think about the way we label images. We don't often describe people in images as human, for example. We might say people, but then who are people? The word person very often means a specific type of person. This isn't an ideal thing, but it is a true thing of images that are put online by people who aren't thinking about it very much, and people who never anticipated that an artificial intelligence system would be looking at their images to generate new images, right? So here's an example of what I mean, taken from a New York Times article in 2018. When Jove Mayer, a wedding and event planner in Brooklyn, is working with a same-sex couple, he sometimes finds himself cringing when he hears a guest use the term gay wedding. It's not with bad intention, he says, but people like to label things because it's easier to discuss, said Mr. Mayer, who runs Jove Mayer events. But the couple is not getting gay married, he says. They are getting married. They're not having a gay wedding, they're having a wedding. You don't go to a straight wedding and say, I'm so happy to be at this straight wedding. So weddings with same-sex couples might be more tightly correlated with phrases like gay wedding and isolated from the category of wedding. This is a categorization that is happening as a result of people's labels and the way that people label these events. And this quote talks about it exactly. People like to label things because it's easier to discuss. Now, initially, if you went into DALL-E 2 and asked for pictures of people kissing, you would almost always get white straight couples for asking for pictures of humans kissing. And now DALL-E 2 inserts diversity into these prompts. When you ask for people or humans, you get diverse pictures of people. You get a wider range of images than you did 6 months ago, or I should say in the middle of 2022. In a paper, Tao Fan and Fabian Offert write, OpenAI took another proactive step on July 18th, 2022, when they released a statement contending that they were, quote, implementing a new technique so that DALL-E generates images of people that more accurately reflect the diversity of the world's population. While the technique in question was not further specified, a user comparing DALL-E 2 generations before and after July 18th would have seen a concrete improvement with more equally distributed gender and race attributes in generated images of people. Twitter user Andy Baio posted the results of an experiment where they prompted DALL-E 2 to produce empty signs by supplying the seemingly incomplete prompt, quote, a sign that spells, with no further instructions. Curiously, DALL-E 2 returned images with people holding signs that spelled words like woman, Africa, black, Asian, or female, leading Baio to the conclusion that OpenAI's de-biasing technique simply consisted in the tacking on of gendered or racialized keywords to some but not all prompts. OpenAI's technique, then, consisted of literally putting words into the user's mouth. It did not fix the model, but the users. In other words, when you type a prompt into DALL-E 2, it invisibly tacks on randomly diversifying keywords, which does not address the biases of the underlying model, but is a system-level adjustment. It's a system-level adaptation. So when you ask for people, you'll get more diverse images than then. But that's the result of a specific system-level intervention that OpenAI made into the outputs. So it is injecting labels into your prompts on DALL-E 2 in order to ensure that the output that you get back is diverse and representative of a wider range of people. It's not a result of the data set. It's a result of an intervention at the system level. So in summary, when images are repeated in the data set, the elements of that particular image will influence the image output more than images that appear less often. Because lay-on and likely clip draw image and text pairs from the internet, they will represent images that appear more often on the internet, such as memes. Once inside the dataset, they are generalized into the larger abstraction for these phrases. Even if you ban or intervene in the generation of these images, they contribute to the way the model understands and responds to the prompt. If you went in and you banned Big Gulp as a prompt, right? The image has still contributed to this category and the model's understanding of the category of typical American. And even at a systemic level intervention where you inject things into prompts or you refuse certain prompts doesn't change the fact that even innocent prompts, me typing the word American, are going to be influenced. The response to that prompt is going to be influenced by the images that it has seen, regardless of whether you ban access to those particular images in the keywords and the prompts that people can use. This is also true of text generation models, by the way. These tools tend to reproduce a consensus based solely on what it sees more of in the data set. In other words, it's going to tell you what people say more often, not what is most true. So we can go into the data set and see what drives the systems that use lay-on. That's diffusion models like Stable Diffusion and Midjourney. Stable Diffusion and Midjourney use lay-on, and we can go into the data set to see what Stable Diffusion and Midjourney are working with. But I want to be clear here too. I just talked about a system-level intervention, right? OpenAI, which uses clip, not lay-on, but they have a system-level intervention. They do something in between your prompt and the data set in order to make sure that the results are diverse, more sort of socially representative. And these systems that use lay-on do similar stuff. So we're looking at this picture of an American, and we can go and look and see what images are in the data set for American, and we can make some inferences. But tools like Midjourney will use a different flavor of lay-on than Stable Diffusion. Think of it as like two taco places next door to the other. And they use the same ingredients from the same local farmers, but one has more beans on their tacos and one has more cheese. A specific example of this is that Midjourney uses aesthetic weights. So Midjourney emphasizes the type of content that gets high scores on Reddit or is popular on image sharing sites. As a result, there's a kind of particular style to Midjourney images that is distinct from Stable Diffusion. So ultimately, there are interventions, and some we know about and others we don't. But fundamentally, the base of these tools is lay-on. Again, for DALL-E 2, it's clip, and clip is even more secretive, right? That restaurant gets ingredients from a totally different grocery store. We don't know what's in their tacos, but we do with lay-on. We can go in and we can say, I know where these ingredients are coming from, but I don't necessarily know what they're doing, how much of those ingredients they're going to use, or what they're going to do to those ingredients before they're served. So I'm beating this metaphor to the ground, but the idea is that you can tweak the data set. So we have an example of one stereotype here for the word American, typical American, and we can see how the connection between the data set influenced that outcome. And I don't want to dive deep into stereotypes today, but it's really important to be aware of how representations of people are formed when we sort people into categories, especially with arbitrary, socially assigned labels. In the assigned video this week from Dr. Sophia Noble, you know that she investigated Google's algorithmic biases in the search for the search term black girls. Searches related to black girls should, in theory, create access to information about black children. Instead, for years, the results reflected pornographic images and representations. The first search result was a pornographic website. There were a whole host of vulgarities on the front page. Actual information about black children, really crucial information about health or education, were completely buried by these pornographic search results. Even a British rock band called Black Girls, which did not contain any black women in the membership of the band, were rated higher than actual information about anything related to black children, black girls. After Dr. Noble's work, Google intervened in these search results directly. So now you are no longer inundated with adult websites when you search for black girls. But if you look at the internet without that intervention, you realize that not much has changed. The images in Layon for the same search remain pornographic, and that is with Layon's safe search filter turned on. The images we see here are often nude women. A number of the images in the dataset are racist memes, but most disturbingly, in this collection of images, which are the first few pages from Layon's search, the black boxes on the page represent explicit pornographic content. If a picture isn't there, it's because it involved actual pornographic material that I covered up with a black square ahead of the lecture. So what we see here is that fundamentally that first page of Google search results is being replicated. Layon has found that same content that Google has intervened in, and it has aggregated that into the same search phrase, black girls. And this shouldn't surprise anybody. Dr. Sophia Noble is not an obscure academic. Dr. Noble's work is widely known. Google has redesigned its search. So why is no one intervening in Layon's results for the same phrase? And again, this is not a result of I have been trained, Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst project. They've designed that project to show us this stuff, so we can make these comments, so we can understand what is in that data set. The purpose of that site is to see what is in Layon. The question I'm asking is, why was Layon let loose when we knew that it would find problematic content, right? It wasn't a secret that it was going to find pornographic images linked to this term. It's been widely known for years, for at least 6 years. So why does this happen? Well, I hope I don't need to explain that black girls have nothing to do with pornography. Instead, I think we can go back to the starting point of this lecture and think about that long ago origin of composite images and their intrinsic link, not only to racist pseudoscience, but to the way that those images were used to hold up a particular group's power and explain the inequality that existed within British society at the time. When we have a technology that scrapes up stereotypes without interruption or intervention, and then simply composites these images into new ones, we're repeating that history. It is even more disturbing to consider what it means to push a button called Dream or Imagine and know that the images you produce are coming from this. Vilna Bashani Treitler writes about this idea of racial categories and the power connected to who gets to define those categories for themselves and who's defined by someone else. Vilna Treitler writes, it makes a difference who is doing the categorical defining and who is policing the boundaries of those definitions. It comes down to a question of power. Who holds it? Where the power holders see themselves and others in this existing hierarchy, where they think they should be in that racial hierarchy, that is, the meaning or racial position, and how they use their power to realize these norms. So again, this is why we focus on data, to know what is there and how it steers our systems, and to be mindful of the ways that data consolidates power and shapes our imagination and dreams. Here we have the training data by comparison for the word girl. It's hard not to look at this data set and think about Francis Galton and the way that his composites were used to suggest that the upper classes were superior people to all others. He proved it through photographs that looked a lot like these, not just because these are images from the same time period, but because they are images that reflect a certain degree of wealth amongst the families who could afford to have their portraits taken at this time period, and the racial category that those families belong to. These are white girls, though the prompt is not for white girls. The prompt is for girls. There is not a pornographic image to be found here. There are no black squares to hide something disturbing. It speaks to the power of the data set to normalize one kind of definition of a word over other definitions. For Leon, as far as Leon has defined the world, girls are white children. Black children are another category, a category separate and definitely unequal. The last one I want to look at today is this, which tells us that it's not just about photographs tied explicitly to race, but that there are all kinds of assumptions that go into this lack of concern about what Leon has found. So this is a search for photographs of a brave person. This search tells you that if you're generating images of bravery, you might get a composite from some of the images you see here. And if you look closely, you'll see something pretty shocking. Scattered across the first few pages of results from Leon for bravery are images of Nazis. The first is an image of a young boy who was given a medal of bravery for his work with the Hitler Youth. The others are difficult to tie to specific caption information, but this is a challenging issue too. Let's assume that these images are presented neutrally, that they didn't necessarily come from pro-Nazi websites, right? They may have, I don't know. But let's say, for the sake of this argument, that they didn't. Let's say they came from an encyclopedia, and that this image of the child from the Hitler Youth came from an encyclopedia that talked explicitly about what the Hitler Youth was, defined it so that people could know. And let's say that the encyclopedia labeled this image factually. Here is a boy who got the Medal of Bravery for his time spent in the Hitler Youth. That's a fact about this child. Once Leon encounters this image, all of that context is stripped away. It is no longer framed as educational content. It's no longer condemned by a website that might be hosting this image, just, to point at this and say, look at the things that were happening. It doesn't care, ultimately, that the boy is in a Nazi uniform. Leon will not recognize that adding this image to the category of brave might lead to images of swastikas in its generated images of heroic people. Leon doesn't understand that. It doesn't know that. And yet it's been deployed in a way to collect these images and use these images to generate images of heroic people. Here's another disturbing ramification of this, which is the Nazis literally defined themselves by their appearances. Their blue eyes, blonde hair, these characteristics were strongly linked to eugenics theories. And they are, in the philosophy of eugenics, proof of strong character. They are proof of bravery. And so on one hand, including images of Nazi heroes in generative images of heroism is ultimately an extension of Nazi propaganda. And that matters when we see images like these, which are generated from a prompt. So here are images for a photograph of a brave man, 1940. I added the date to make a point. But now clearly one of them is also Liam Neeson, right? So this is coming from, right? Here speaking about Schindler's List, Oskar Schindler. But I think the images speak to the complexity of the images we make with these tools with regard to respecting the sources of their training data and understanding their original context. When we put images online, we contextualize them. We say, here's why we want to show you this. This is a good thing. This is a bad thing. Here's something we don't want to see any more of, right? Or here's something that we do want to see more of. There's context to it. But when Leon goes out, it strips that context away. All that is in there is the image and the words in the prompt. It doesn't know why that image is up there. It doesn't know why that image might be hurtful. It doesn't know that it might extend Nazi propaganda campaign, right? This photograph of this boy is taken for a Nazi propaganda campaign. And this distinction is not new. In 2019, Yoon Seo-jo and Timnit Gebru wrote a paper called Lessons from Archives, Strategies for Collecting Socio-Cultural Data in Machine Learning. And they noted that one area, to quote, one area in which current ML data collection practices differ from those of curatorial archives is the level of intervention and supervision. In practice, data collection in significant ML subfields is done without following a rigorous procedure or set of guidelines. While some subfields in machine learning have fine-grained approaches to data collection, others emphasize size and efficiency. This approach often encourages data collection to be indiscriminate. Taking data in masses without critiquing its origin, motivation, platform, and potential impact results in minimally supervised data collection. And that brings us to some of the examples that we saw here. And so this leads us to this controversy around images and the way that they are used when they are automated and when we lose agency over their use. And if you've been reading a lot of the news and reading a lot of the social media posts or talking to your friends, you may be very familiar with this idea that when artists upload images online, their images are being stripped of the context through which those artists are sharing that work. Images put online by artists to share with other people, maybe to sell their work, maybe to just show what they're proud of, are being taken into the model and being used to train the data set to say, for example, here is an image of a painting. Here is an image of a particular style of painting. Here's an image of a drawing of a dragon, right? Now, the same principles that apply to context, that apply to representation around the images we saw today, are at the heart of the controversy around the use of artists' works and artists' styles in these data sets. And in the next class session, we're going to look at some of the artists who confront these issues in their work, thinking about the ways to challenge these systems and make them better. But we're also going to think about the artists whose work is getting incorporated into these models and what that means for the representation of artists and the styles and techniques that you're using in your prompts and what they're drawing from when they create an image. So in the end, I know today's class had some challenging topics, but I hope you'll understand why. It's not about rejecting these tools outright. It's about understanding where they come from and how they work and trying to find your own way of using them responsibly and carefully. Carefully, not just for yourself. We often talk about these risks in terms of copyright protection and how not to get sued or to make sure that your work is original. And that's important too. But there's also the risk that you might hurt other people and that these images might perpetuate harmful stereotypes in ways that we can't anticipate. So we need to treat these tools with care. We should think carefully about what these images are, and we should not assume that these technologies we're using are neutral or safe or watched over by somebody. I'm going to leave it there today, and I'm going to encourage you to take the extra time to watch some of the materials in the reading list if you haven't already. The videos that I put together dive a little deeper into some of the questions around bias, algorithmic bias, bias in data sets, and these kinds of things from some of the leading experts. So thanks so much, and I will see you in the next class.